In March 2011, the United States and its allies dismantled Libya's military power in less than 8 months. Muammar Gaddafi was removed. The regime collapsed. The air campaign was declared a success. And then, America left. No occupation force. No long-term stabilization plan. No attempt to control the territory that had just been shattered. From a traditional military perspective, this made no sense. Why destroy a state's coercive capacity, and then abandon the space it once controlled? Why accept a power vacuum when every military textbook warns against it? And why did this pattern repeat, in Iraq, Afghanistan, Syria, under different administrations, with different rhetoric, but the same outcome? Because this was not indecision. It was a deliberate strategic choice. A strategy that rejected territorial control, embraced withdrawal, and treated instability as an acceptable cost. But was this restraint, or was it a different kind of gamble, one whose consequences would not appear until years later? At the core of this episode is a strategic paradox that modern military doctrine rarely confronts directly. The United States did not lack the ability to occupy. It lacked the willingness to inherit what occupation actually means. Traditional war assumes a linear logic: destroy the enemy's force, seize territory, impose order, then negotiate from a position of control. But strike and withdraw breaks that chain deliberately. This strategy treats territorial control not as a prize, but as a liability. It assumes that prolonged presence creates political drag, domestic backlash, and strategic paralysis that outweigh any gains from stabilization. The real objective, therefore, is not victory in the classical sense. It is avoidance of quagmire, of indefinite responsibility, of becoming the manager of a broken society. This is what makes the strategy fundamentally unorthodox. It accepts that war can end without resolution. It accepts instability as a downstream cost. And it assumes that long-term consequences can be managed later, through deterrence, remote strikes, or selective re-engagement. But here is the unresolved question that shadows every such decision. If you deliberately collapse a system and refuse to replace it, are you avoiding failure, or simply postponing it? Because once control is abandoned, outcomes no longer obey your intentions. They obey whoever moves fastest into the vacuum you leave behind. And it is inside that vacuum that the real war begins. Before strike and withdraw could exist as a strategy, the strategic environment had already narrowed the range of acceptable choices. This was not a battlefield shaped by maneuver alone. It was a battlefield constrained by politics, logistics, legitimacy, and time. The United States entered these interventions with overwhelming military superiority, but with sharply limited political capital. Every deployment carried a domestic expiration date. Every additional month on the ground increased the risk that the war would outlast public tolerance. The enemy, meanwhile, did not need to win conventionally. They only needed to survive. This asymmetry distorted the entire strategic map. The actors and their real objectives. On paper, the conflicts looked familiar. A powerful external force confronting a weakened state or fragmented insurgent landscape. In practice, the objectives were incompatible. The United States sought disruption, not governance. It wanted to neutralize threats, degrade hostile capabilities, and exit without inheriting long-term responsibility. Local actors sought control, not stability. Militias, factions, and political entrepreneurs understood that whoever filled the post-intervention vacuum would shape the future order, however violent or fragile that order might be. This mismatch meant there was no shared definition of end state. One side wanted to leave. The other side wanted to stay, on its own terms. Strategic constraints that eliminated normal options. Several constraints quietly ruled out traditional occupation long before the first strike. First, legitimacy. Extended occupation had become politically radioactive. Every prior example had trained both domestic and international audiences to see long-term presence not as stabilization, but as domination. Second, time. Modern interventions were conducted under implicit clocks. Election cycles, coalition fatigue, and media pressure imposed limits that no battlefield success could erase. Third, force protection. Urbanized conflicts and irregular warfare dramatically increased exposure to casualties without offering decisive gains in return. Fourth, coalition fragility. Most interventions depended on multinational support that could fracture under the strain of prolonged commitment. Under these constraints, occupation was not merely risky. It was structurally unstable. The longer forces stayed, the weaker the political foundation became. The geography of friction. The terrain itself resisted control. Not because it was impassable, but because it was socially fragmented. Cities without trusted institutions. Borders that existed on maps but not in practice. Local power networks that operated independently of any central authority. In such environments, holding territory did not translate into holding power. Control required constant presence. Presence required legitimacy. Legitimacy required outcomes no external force could guarantee. The strategic map offered no clean lines, only pressure points. The opponent's hidden advantage. From the outside, adversaries appeared weaker. They lacked air power, logistics, and unified command. But they possessed something the intervening force did not: time without deadlines. Every delay favored adaptation. Every withdrawal favored reconstitution. Insurgent and militia groups did not need stability. They thrived on uncertainty. The longer the external force debated next steps, the more local actors reorganized around violence as currency. This created a paradox. The very effort to avoid occupation accelerated the conditions that made future intervention more likely. Intelligence blind spots. Strategic assessments tended to overestimate controllability. Planners assumed that once central authority collapsed, alternative structures could be selectively supported, or at least monitored, from a distance. What they underestimated was speed. Power vacuums do not remain neutral. They are filled rapidly by actors willing to use force without restraint. Remote intelligence struggled to distinguish signal from noise. Local allegiances shifted faster than reporting cycles could track. By the time patterns became visible, they were already entrenched. The illusion of optionality. Perhaps the most dangerous feature of the strategic map was the illusion of choice. From headquarters, strike and withdraw appeared reversible. If conditions worsened, forces could return. If threats re-emerged, precision strikes could resume. This created a sense of strategic flexibility. But flexibility is not the same as control. Each withdrawal reduced leverage. Each return became costlier, politically and operationally. The map was not static. It evolved with every decision not to stay. The compression of decision space. As constraints tightened, options collapsed. Full occupation was politically unsustainable. Total disengagement was strategically risky. Hybrid approaches satisfied neither. Strike and withdraw emerged not as an elegant solution, but as the least catastrophic available option within a shrinking decision space. It promised action without entanglement. Force without permanence. Influence without ownership. But this promise rested on a fragile assumption: that the system could absorb shock without producing consequences beyond the point of withdrawal. That assumption would soon be tested. Because within these constraints, where control was costly, time was hostile, and legitimacy was brittle, a decision began to form that openly defied military orthodoxy. And that decision would require rejecting everything the textbook prescribed. Every military institution carries a default answer to instability. Secure the ground. Control the population. Build institutions under protection. Stay long enough for order to take root. This logic is not controversial. It is the accumulated memory of centuries of warfare. From counterinsurgency doctrine to post-conflict stabilization manuals, the prescription is consistent. Power must be present to be effective. And yet, in the interventions that define the modern era, this prescription was deliberately rejected. Not because it was unknown, but because, under contemporary constraints, it no longer worked. The normal option most commanders would choose. A conventional approach would have followed a predictable sequence. After regime collapse or decisive military action, forces would remain in sufficient numbers to prevent fragmentation. Key terrain, cities, borders, infrastructure, would be secured. Local security forces would be trained under direct supervision. Political transition would occur inside a controlled security envelope. This model assumes friction, but promises leverage. It accepts short-term cost in exchange for long-term influence. For most commanders trained in classical doctrine, This is the only way war makes sense. Anything else feels incomplete, irresponsible, dangerous. And that instinct is not wrong. Why this approach became strategically unviable? The problem was not military feasibility. It was strategic sustainability. Occupation demanded a scale of commitment that extended far beyond battlefield success. Troop levels had to remain high long after major combat ended. Casualties accumulated without visible progress. Political patience eroded faster than institutions could be built. More critically, the occupying force became the center of gravity. Every failure was attributed to it. Every delay was blamed on it. Every local grievance found its target. Instead of stabilizing the system, prolonged presence increasingly distorted it. Local actors optimized their behavior around the occupier, seeking protection, manipulating resources, or provoking confrontation. Stability became performative. Dependence became structural. The occupation trap. What doctrine rarely emphasizes is exit friction. Once an external force assumes responsibility for security, disengagement becomes exponentially harder. Local institutions adapt to protection rather than autonomy. Security forces defer initiative. Political elites delay compromise, expecting enforcement from outside. The longer occupation persists, the more catastrophic withdrawal becomes. This creates a trap. Stay, and legitimacy decays. Leave, and collapse accelerates. By the time this trap is recognized, the decision space has already closed. Why commanders hesitated, and why that hesitation mattered. Many military leaders understood this danger intuitively. They saw how presence created dependence. How control bred resistance. How time worked against them. But they were also bound by doctrine, expectations, and institutional memory. Walking away from occupation felt like abandoning the mission halfway. It violated deeply ingrained notions of responsibility. And yet, staying threatened to turn military success into strategic defeat. This was not a technical dilemma. It was a moral and institutional one. Choosing strike and withdraw required accepting that some problems could not be solved by staying longer. That assumption alone placed decision-makers outside the comfort zone of their profession. The misfit between doctrine and environment. The textbook model assumes certain conditions. A population that eventually accepts imposed order. Institutions that can be rebuilt under supervision. A political process that rewards patience. In fragmented environments, none of these conditions hold. Authority is contested at the local level. Violence is decentralized. Loyalty shifts rapidly. Holding territory does not pacify these systems. It freezes them in an unstable equilibrium, one that collapses the moment pressure is removed. In such contexts, doctrine becomes a liability. It demands commitment where commitment creates vulnerability. The strategic reversal. Strike and withdraw inverted the logic. Instead of treating presence as leverage, it treated presence as exposure. Instead of assuming control leads to stability, it assumed control amplifies resistance. This reversal was radical. It reframed success not as transformation, but as damage limitation. The objective was no longer to build a new order. It was to prevent the worst outcomes while avoiding ownership of the system itself. From a doctrinal standpoint, this looked like surrendering initiative. From a political standpoint, it looked like prudence. From a strategic standpoint, it was a gamble that the system could absorb shock without spiraling. The cost of rejecting the textbook. Walking away from doctrine did not eliminate risk. It redistributed it. Risk moved from deployed forces to local populations. From immediate casualties to long-term instability. From visible failure to deferred consequences. This trade-off was rarely articulated clearly. Instead, it was buried beneath language about flexibility, precision, and restraint. But the underlying choice was stark. Accept the burden of control, or accept the uncertainty of abandonment. There was no third option. The uncomfortable truth. The reason most commanders would not choose strike and withdraw is simple. It offers no guarantee. No clear victory condition. No satisfying end state. It asks leaders to accept ambiguity as policy. And that runs against everything military institutions are designed to do. Yet under modern constraints, the textbook solution had become strategically untenable. Which meant that the unorthodox option, however dangerous, was no longer optional. It was the only path left open. And once that realization set in, the decision to abandon control did not emerge gradually. It arrived as a rupture, driven by a small set of assumptions that would redefine how force was used. The decision to strike and withdraw did not emerge from confidence. It emerged from exhaustion with every other option. Inside planning rooms, the debate was not framed as innovation versus tradition. It was framed as damage control versus institutional collapse. Commanders, civilian leaders, and advisors were no longer asking how to win. They were asking how to stop losing in ways that could not be reversed. Who pushed? Who resisted? The proposal did not come from a single strategist or a unified doctrine. It formed at the intersection of competing pressures. Military planners warned that prolonged presence would hollow out readiness. Diplomats warned that occupation would poison alliances. Political leaders warned that domestic support had a fixed lifespan. Resistance came from within the profession itself. Senior officers trained in classical doctrine questioned the logic. If control was abandoned, what exactly was being achieved? If the enemy was not decisively defeated, what prevented recurrence? These were not academic objections. They were institutional alarms. The collapse of the end state concept. At the center of the debate was a quiet admission. There was no credible end state. No political configuration that external force could guarantee. No timeline that reconciled security with legitimacy. No transition plan that survived contact with local realities. Once this became undeniable, the framework of decision-making shifted. Instead of designing a future order, planners began designing exit conditions. This was the conceptual break. Strategy was no longer about shaping outcomes. It was about bounding exposure. The core assumptions behind the decision. 3 assumptions, rarely stated explicitly, anchored the choice. First, presence creates more enemies than it neutralizes over time. The longer foreign forces remain, the more resistance consolidates around identity, humiliation, and grievance. Second, local systems will reconstitute regardless of external intent. Collapse does not create emptiness. It creates competition. Third, future threats can be managed without continuous control. Precision strikes, surveillance, and deterrence would replace occupation as tools of influence. None of these assumptions were safe. But together, they formed a logic that justified withdrawal not as retreat, but as risk management. What the strategy was really targeting. Strike and withdraw was not primarily aimed at destroying armies. It targeted structures, command networks, coercive institutions, centralized authority that could mobilize resistance at scale. The intent was to fragment capability without inheriting responsibility. By breaking the state's capacity to act coherently, planners believed they could reduce the likelihood of large-scale threats, while avoiding the cost of rebuilding what they had dismantled. This was a narrow, surgical objective. And it carried a dangerous implication. The moment of commitment. The decisive moment came not when the strategy was approved, but when alternatives were quietly removed. Force packages were designed without sustainment for long-term presence. Post-conflict planning was deliberately minimal. Exit timelines were embedded from the start. These were not accidents. They were signals. Once implemented, reversal would require political courage few leaders possessed. At that point, the decision ceased to be theoretical. The system had committed itself to non-ownership. Internal risk acknowledgement. Privately, many planners recognized the exposure. They understood that collapse without stabilization could empower actors worse than those removed. They understood that deterrence without presence relied heavily on intelligence fidelity. They understood that reintervention would be politically harder than initial intervention. But the calculation favored immediacy. Future risk could be deferred. Present risk demanded action. This temporal bias shaped the entire strategy. The strategic bet. At its core, strike and withdraw was a bet on asymmetry of tolerance. That adversaries would fracture rather than consolidate. That local violence would remain contained. That external threats would not regenerate faster than monitoring and strike capabilities. It was a bet that time would not amplify the consequences of abandonment. History would test that bet repeatedly. The silence around responsibility. What is most striking is what the decision explicitly avoided. There was no formal doctrine explaining how to manage the aftermath. No clear ownership of long-term outcomes. No institutional mechanism to absorb delayed consequences. Responsibility became diffused. Outcomes could always be attributed to local dynamics. Failures could be framed as internal dysfunctions rather than strategic design. This diffusion was not incidental. It was protective. The irreversibility problem. Once withdrawal became policy, the cost of reversal multiplied. Returning meant admitting miscalculation. Reoccupying meant inheriting a system more degraded than before. Staying out meant accepting instability as baseline. This locked decision-makers into a narrow corridor. They could adjust tactics, but not the premise. The decision that changed the war's nature. By rejecting occupation, leaders did more than alter force posture. They redefined what war was allowed to accomplish. War was no longer a tool for resolution. It became a tool for temporary suppression. Victory became episodic. Stability became optional. And responsibility became conditional. The decision was made under pressure, justified by constraints, and defended as restraint. But its true test would come not in the moment of withdrawal, but in how the system behaved once the force was gone. On paper, strike and withdraw looked clean. Short deployments. Clear objectives. Minimal footprint. In practice, it required an unusually precise choreography, one mistake away from cascading failure. Execution was not about overwhelming force. It was about timing, sequencing, and restraint under pressure. And restraint, in war, is harder to sustain than aggression. From concept to contact. The operational design prioritized speed. Air power and special operations led. Targets were selected for systemic effect rather than symbolic victory. Command nodes, logistics hubs, and regime enablers were neutralized quickly. The objective was to collapse coherence, not annihilate resistance. This required front-loaded intensity. Once momentum slowed, the strategy lost leverage. Prolonged engagement would blur the line between intervention and occupation, the very outcome planners sought to avoid. So the tempo remained high. The logistics of not staying. What execution manuals rarely address is the logistics of leaving. Withdrawal is not the absence of operations. It is a distinct operational phase with its own vulnerabilities. Forces had to extract without signaling weakness. Bases were dismantled rapidly to avoid becoming fixed targets. Supply chains were rerouted before local actors could interfere. Every delay increased exposure. This compressed timeline forced trade-offs. Equipment was destroyed rather than recovered. Relationships with local partners were truncated. Intelligence collection shifted from persistent presence to episodic access. Each trade-off reduced immediate risk, but increased uncertainty. The dependence on precision. Without sustained presence, the strategy leaned heavily on precision. Precision strikes. Precision intelligence. Precision timing. This concentration created a single point of failure. If intelligence degraded, the entire model destabilized. If targeting errors occurred, legitimacy evaporated instantly. If civilian harm escalated, political support collapsed. There was no margin for correction. Unlike occupation, which absorbs mistakes through persistence, strike and withdraw amplified them. Micro-twist 1, the intelligence gap. The first stress fracture appeared after initial success. Withdrawing forces reduced on-the-ground visibility faster than anticipated. Local informant networks unraveled as protection disappeared. Signals intelligence captured movement, but not intent. Planners had assumed that technological surveillance could compensate. It could not. Patterns emerged too late. By the time reorganization was detected, it was already operational. This did not immediately collapse the strategy, but it exposed its fragility. The illusion of control at distance. Remote operations created an illusion of omniscience. Drones loitered overhead. Satellites tracked movement. Strike capabilities remained available. But control at distance lacks contextual fidelity. Local dynamics, tribal shifts, factional realignments, economic incentives, escaped remote analysis. Violence did not disappear. It redistributed. And redistribution is harder to counter than concentration. Microtwist 2, the accidental escalation. At least once in nearly every such campaign, a miscalculation occurred. A strike eliminated the wrong actor. A proxy force overreached. A symbolic site was damaged. These incidents forced a dilemma. Escalate to reassert credibility and risk entanglement. Or absorb the cost and signal constraint. Most of the time, restraint prevailed. Each choice reinforced the strategy's premise. Each choice also signaled limits that adversaries learned to exploit. Managing risk without owning outcomes. Execution doctrine quietly shifted responsibility downward. Local partners were empowered, but not controlled. Their actions created consequences the intervening force could not fully manage. When they failed, it was framed as local dysfunction. When they succeeded, it was framed as validation of the strategy. This asymmetry protected decision-makers, but it distorted accountability. Over time, the distinction between enabling and endorsing blurred. The cost of speed. Rapid withdrawal achieved its immediate aim, avoiding the perception of occupation. But speed came at a price. Institutional collapse occurred faster than alternative structures could form. Security vacuums expanded before any stabilizing force emerged. This was not unforeseen. It was discounted. Planners assumed that fragmentation would prevent consolidation. They underestimated how quickly violent actors adapt when stakes are existential. The reintervention dilemma. As instability grew, the question returned, quietly at first. Should force be reapplied? Reintervention exposed the core contradiction. If force returned too soon, withdrawal looked pointless. If force stayed out too long, threats metastasized. Each option carried political cost. Most responses were incremental. Limited strikes. Advisory missions. Covert support. None addressed the structural vacuum. Execution without resolution. By design, execution avoided closure. There was no occupation phase to transition out of. No handover ceremony. No clear declaration of success beyond metrics of degradation. This ambiguity was strategic. It allowed disengagement without admission of failure. But it also denied the system a narrative of completion. Wars faded from headlines, but not from reality. The thin margin between discipline and drift. What kept the strategy from collapsing entirely was discipline. Strict rules of engagement. Narrow objectives. Constant reassessment of exposure. But discipline is perishable. As time passed, institutional memory eroded. New actors entered the system without experiencing the initial shock. Drift set in. Operations became reactive. Objectives blurred. The original logic weakened. Where the strategy nearly broke. The strategy came closest to failure not during the strikes, but afterward. When violence surged beyond expected thresholds. When partners fractured faster than anticipated. When intelligence gaps widened beyond correction. At those moments, the absence of ownership became acute. There was no authority to impose order. Only capacity to punish. And punishment without control rarely produces stability. The unspoken outcome. Execution achieved what it set out to do. It avoided large-scale occupation. It reduced immediate exposure. It preserved political flexibility. But it also normalized a new pattern. War as episodic intervention. Force without settlement. Withdrawal without resolution. This pattern did not end conflict. It reconfigured it. And as the intervening force adjusted to this new normal, adversaries began to do the same. Because the next decisive move would not come from execution, but from how the opponent interpreted restraint as signal. The opponent did not interpret withdrawal as an ending. They interpreted it as information. Every military action sends signals. Every restraint is read as intention. Every absence is analyzed more carefully than presence. When external forces struck and then withdrew, the battlefield did not quiet. It recalibrated. The first reading, confusion, not clarity. Initially, the response was fragmented. Local actors struggled to understand the logic. The strikes were devastating but brief. The departure was abrupt but incomplete. Was this a pause? A feint? A prelude to occupation? This uncertainty slowed reaction. Groups waited. They watched. They tested the perimeter. This hesitation was the intervening force's greatest advantage, and it was temporary. The second reading, restraint as boundary. Once withdrawal held, interpretation shifted. Restraint began to look like a boundary rather than a pause. Opponents mapped behavior patterns. They noted what triggered retaliation and what did not. They learned which actions provoked response and which were tolerated. This learning process mattered more than ideology. It transformed the conflict from confrontation into calibration. Violence became experimental. Where doctrine misled them. Many adversaries initially misread the strategy through their own doctrinal lens. They assumed withdrawal indicated weakness. That absence signaled exhaustion. That escalation would force re-entry. This assumption was only partially correct. Escalation did draw attention, but not necessarily presence. Remote strikes increased. Targeting intensified. But territorial control was still avoided. The expected occupation never came. This contradiction forced adaptation. The realization, control was no longer the trigger. Over time, adversaries recognized a crucial shift. Control of territory was no longer the red line. Threat projection was. Groups that avoided direct external targets survived. Groups that attempted to consolidate visibly were punished. This altered behavior. Rather than building states, actors built networks. Rather than governing openly, they governed indirectly. Rather than holding ground, they held leverage. The battlefield decentralized. The strategic miscalculation. Here is where the opponent misread the deeper signal. They assumed restraint meant predictability. That once thresholds were understood, they could operate safely beneath them. That remote intervention could be managed through dispersion and ambiguity. They underestimated two things. First, the intervening force's tolerance for episodic violence. Second, its capacity to strike selectively without warning. This miscalculation led to overconfidence. Actors expanded influence too quickly. They tested boundaries too openly. They forgot that surveillance does not require presence. The point of overreach. Eventually, pressure mounted. Internal competition intensified. Resources became contested. Violence escalated beyond calibrated levels. This was the moment restraint flipped. Targets that had remained untouched were suddenly hit. Leadership figures believed to be secure were removed. Networks assumed to be invisible were exposed. The opponent had learned the pattern but misunderstood its elasticity. Structural weaknesses exposed. Decentralization protected against occupation, but not against disruption. Without centralized authority, coordination suffered. Without legitimacy, enforcement relied on coercion alone. Remote strikes amplified these weaknesses. Leadership losses created power struggles. Power struggles triggered internal violence. Internal violence consumed attention and resources. The system cannibalized itself. The irony of adaptation. In adapting to strike and withdraw, adversaries reinforced its logic. By avoiding overt control, they reduced justification for occupation. By fragmenting authority, they limited the effectiveness of governance. By embracing instability, they made stabilization politically unattractive. But this adaptation came at a cost. Their systems became brittle. Resilient to presence, but vulnerable to disruption. The missed strategic question. What adversaries rarely asked was the most important one. Not whether they could survive without occupation, but whether survival in permanent instability was victory at all. They equated endurance with success. They mistook persistence for progress. This misalignment shaped their long-term trajectory. The silent shift in initiative. Over time, initiative quietly changed hands. Not on the ground, but in decision space. External forces no longer reacted to events. They reacted to patterns. Opponents no longer controlled escalation. They merely influenced timing. The conflict stabilized into a low-intensity equilibrium, volatile but managed. The final misreading. The greatest misinterpretation was philosophical. Opponents believed withdrawal meant disengagement. They believed restraint meant disinterest. They failed to grasp the strategic shift. This was not about winning territory. It was about managing exposure. Force was no longer used to end wars. It was used to prevent any side from ending them on unfavorable terms. This realization came too late. By the time it did, the strategic environment had already changed. Because what followed was not a decisive victory, but a prolonged condition of instability whose cost would be measured far beyond the battlefield. The outcome of strike and withdraw cannot be measured by territory gained or regimes removed. Its results are diffuse, delayed, often visible only years later. This is not a strategy that produces clean endings. It produces conditions. And those conditions carry costs that are rarely assigned to the decision that created them. The immediate outcome, tactical success, strategic ambiguity. In the short term, the strategy achieved its stated objectives. Hostile capabilities were degraded. Centralized command structures were disrupted. External forces exited without being drawn into prolonged occupation. From a narrow operational lens, this looked like success. There was no quagmire. No endless counterinsurgency. No open-ended commitment. But the absence of visible failure masked the absence of resolution. Wars did not end. They changed shape. The human cost, displacement without protection. The largest burden fell where the strategy had least visibility. Civilian populations were left inside fractured systems. Security collapsed faster than alternative authority could emerge. Violence localized, but did not diminish. Displacement became chronic rather than acute. Communities adapted not to peace, but to instability as baseline. This was not collateral damage in the traditional sense. It was a structural consequence. By dismantling coercive capacity without replacing it, the strategy transferred risk downward, onto populations without leverage or protection. The logistics cost, permanent readiness, permanent drain. Avoiding occupation did not eliminate military expenditure. It restructured it. Resources shifted toward surveillance, rapid deployment forces, and strike capabilities maintained indefinitely. Readiness became a standing requirement rather than a temporary surge. This posture was less visible, but not cheaper. Forces rotated without closure. Equipment cycles shortened. Operational fatigue accumulated without the psychological release of conclusion. The military was not at war, but it was never fully at peace. The political cost, credibility without commitment. Politically, the strategy preserved short-term flexibility. Leaders avoided the optics of occupation. Casualty figures remained lower than in sustained ground campaigns. Exit narratives were easier to construct. But credibility eroded quietly. Allies learned that support was conditional and time-bound. Local partners learned that alignment did not guarantee protection. Opponents learned that patience was rewarded. Commitments became transactional. Promises became provisional. This did not collapse alliances, but it thinned them. The psychological cost to decision-makers. The burden of ambiguity fell heavily on those who authorized withdrawal. They were spared immediate backlash, but denied closure. Every resurgence of violence reopened the question: should we have stayed longer? Every reintervention carried the implication of unfinished business. Every refusal to return carried the weight of abandonment. This produced a cycle of justification rather than resolution. Decisions were defended repeatedly, sometimes long after the original context had disappeared. The cost of deferred consequences. The most dangerous cost was temporal. Instability did not peak and decline. It plateaued. Years later, threats re-emerged in mutated forms. Networks adapted. Violence diffused. At that point, attribution became difficult. Was this the result of withdrawal, or of local dynamics? Of strategy, or of circumstance? This ambiguity protected the strategy from indictment. But it did not protect the system from consequences. If the strategy had failed, where would it have broken? Failure scenarios were not hypothetical. They clustered around three fault lines. First, misjudged fragmentation. If local actors consolidated faster than expected, the vacuum would harden into a hostile order. Second, intelligence degradation. Without reliable ground presence, threats could mature undetected. Third, political shock. A single mass casualty event traced back to the vacuum could collapse tolerance instantly. These risks were known. They were accepted. Why the strategy persisted despite the cost? Given these outcomes, why did strike and withdraw remain attractive? Because its costs were diffuse, while its benefits were immediate. Because it avoided visible failure, even if it enabled invisible instability. Because it aligned with political cycles better than with historical ones. And because no alternative promised better outcomes at acceptable cost. The strategy survived not because it solved the problem, but because it redistributed pain in ways the system could tolerate. The uncomfortable accounting. If occupation externalized cost onto intervening forces, strike and withdraw externalized cost onto time and geography. The bill did not disappear. It was deferred. Paid in smaller installments. By actors with less voice. This is the moral shadow of the strategy. Not that it was cruel by intent, but that it was indifferent by design. The strategic residue. What remained after execution and withdrawal was not peace. It was residue. Fragmented authority. Persistent violence. A landscape shaped by absence. This residue shaped future decisions. Every new intervention was filtered through the memory of the last. Every restraint was justified by past entanglements. The strategy became self-reinforcing. The central question it leaves behind. At the end of the accounting, one question remains unresolved. Is a strategy that avoids catastrophic failure, but guarantees chronic instability, actually sustainable? Or does it simply delay the moment when the cost becomes unavoidable? Because history does not erase deferred consequences. It compounds them. And it is here, beyond outcomes and costs, that the deeper meaning of this strategy must finally be confronted. To understand strike and withdraw, we have to stop treating it as a tactical preference and start treating it as a diagnosis. It is not a solution to instability. It is an admission about what modern war can no longer reliably achieve. What this strategy is actually about. At its core, strike and withdraw is not about restraint. It is about limits. Limits of political patience. Limits of institutional endurance. Limits of external control over fractured societies. The strategy emerges when the cost of shaping outcomes exceeds the system's tolerance for ownership. In that sense, it is not a doctrine of confidence. It is a doctrine of bounded ambition. War is no longer used to build a future order. It is used to prevent the worst alternatives, temporarily. The rule it breaks. Classical warfare rests on a simple principle. Force must be followed by authority. Strike and withdraw violates this outright. It separates destruction from governance. Punishment from responsibility. Intervention from obligation. This separation would have been unthinkable in earlier eras. Not because leaders were more ethical, but because instability traveled slower, and consequences remained local. Modern connectivity erased that buffer. Yet the strategy persists anyway. That contradiction defines contemporary conflict. The three assumptions that redefine war. The strategy rests on three implicit beliefs. First, control is no longer proportional to presence. Holding territory does not guarantee influence, and absence does not eliminate leverage. Second, time is weaponized differently. Short-term disengagement is prioritized over long-term settlement, even if it produces chronic instability. Third, responsibility can be modular. Interveners believe they can choose which consequences to own, and which to defer. These assumptions are not taught openly. They are absorbed through experience. And they quietly reshape how force is applied. Why this strategy feels inevitable, and why that is dangerous. Strike and withdraw feels inevitable because alternatives appear worse. Occupation looks like stagnation. Disengagement looks like surrender. Hybrid approaches satisfy neither. In this narrowed landscape, the strategy presents itself as realism. But inevitability is not the same as wisdom. Once accepted as normal, the strategy lowers expectations of what war should resolve. Conflict becomes maintenance. Violence becomes background. Resolution becomes optional. This is not stability. It is managed volatility. Can this strategy be repeated? The answer is yes, and that is the problem. It can be repeated precisely because it avoids decisive outcomes. Each iteration reinforces the logic of the last. Each withdrawal becomes precedent. Each reintervention becomes justification. Over time, the system adapts around this rhythm. Enemies learn to endure. Allies learn to hedge. Institutions learn to operate without closure. The strategy scales, but resolution does not. The illusion of learning. Proponents often claim adaptation. Better intelligence. Smaller footprints. More precise strikes. But these are refinements, not corrections. They optimize execution without questioning premise. The central question remains untouched. Can force that refuses ownership ever produce durable order? So far, the answer has been avoidance rather than evidence. What this reveals about modern power? More than anything, strike and withdraw reveals a shift in how power is exercised. Power is no longer about transformation. It is about constraint. Not building states, but limiting threats. Not winning wars, but preventing escalation. This is a defensive posture masquerading as control. And it reflects a deeper uncertainty about the capacity to shape complex systems from the outside. The unspoken trade-off. The strategy trades decisiveness for flexibility. It avoids catastrophic failure, but accepts chronic instability. It reduces immediate cost, but increases cumulative risk. This trade-off is rarely debated openly because it lacks spectacle. There are no surrender ceremonies. No clear defeats. No clear victories. Only persistence. The question that refuses to go away. At the end of this analysis, one question remains. If modern war is no longer capable of producing resolution, and if strategies are designed primarily to avoid responsibility, then what, exactly, is war for? Is it still an instrument of political outcome? Or has it become a tool for managing decline, delay, and disorder? Strike and withdraw does not answer that question. It exposes it. The final assessment. This strategy should not be judged by whether it worked once, or even several times. It should be judged by what it normalizes. A world where force intervenes without commitment. Where instability is acceptable if it is distant. Where the absence of disaster is mistaken for success. That is not a failure of execution. It is a choice about what kind of order is worth pursuing. And once that choice is made, the war may appear to end. But the consequences never do. Strike and withdraw does not belong to a single administration, a single war, or a single doctrine. It is the symptom of a deeper transformation. A transformation in how modern powers understand what war can realistically deliver, and what it can no longer promise. For most of history, war was justified by its endpoint. Victory meant control. Control meant order. Order meant responsibility. This strategy breaks that chain. It uses force without committing to outcomes. It accepts collapse without inheritance. It intervenes not to resolve, but to constrain. That is why it feels incomplete. And why it persists. Because in a world where political patience is short, legitimacy is fragile, and systems are too complex to rebuild from the outside, resolution becomes a liability. Staying means owning failure. Leaving means dispersing it. Strike and withdraw chooses dispersion. Not because it is clean, but because it is survivable. What this strategy ultimately reveals is not military weakness, but strategic uncertainty. A recognition that power can destroy faster than it can construct. That presence generates resistance as reliably as absence generates chaos. And that modern war increasingly operates in the space between those two dangers. This is not cowardice. Nor is it mastery. It is a compromise with reality. But compromises accumulate. Each withdrawal normalizes unfinished wars. Each intervention without settlement teaches all sides to adapt to instability rather than escape it. Over time, war ceases to be an event. It becomes an environment. And environments shape behavior more deeply than battles ever could. If this is the future of conflict, then the most important question is no longer how wars are fought, but whether anyone still intends to end them. Because when war stops trying to conclude, Strategy stops being about victory. It becomes about living with consequences that never fully arrive and never fully disappear.